Will, what would you say is the most admirable value that one can be taught as a child?
Ooh. Wow.
Have I stumped you?
I mean, I could give you a list of 3 admirable traits, but most makes it difficult. I'm going to say, and this isn't reflecting my parenting skills because I'm thinking about this and coming off of the top of my head rather than considering it deeply. A desire for the betterment of mankind.
Okay, that's a pretty good one.
Yeah.
Now, how about
empathy?
Context with the foreknowledge of the episode we're about to do?
Yeah.
Would you say it might be sharing?
Oh yeah, that's a much better one.
In fact, would you say that it might be extremely noble if one were to devote one's life to allowing Windows computers and Linux computers and really all Unix computers of any type to share files back and forth?
I do love a good file share. I remember how excited I was the first time I shared a file with another computer without having to carry a thing from one computer to the next.
Oh man. Sharing is one thing, but sharing and lethargy?
Yeah. I could just sit in my chair.
Sign me up.
Welcome to the FossPod. I'm Will.
I'm Brad.
Brad, we're here today to talk about sharing.
Sharing is caring.
And it's also a little scary.
Sharing files is caring files. That doesn't.
But it is about caring about files. Like the history of the Samba project is about. There's a little bit of preservation in there, I'm sure, as well. But yeah, we're talking today to Jeremy Allison about Samba. He's one of the creators and maintainers of Samba, which is, as I assume most people listening know, open source software that allows Windows machines to talk to, well, pretty much anything. Like it's a Windows protocol, a Microsoft protocol originally, that has since become one of the main ways that we share files on local networks around the world.
This might be a little too 90s view of Microsoft, but I've often thought of Samba as a necessary evil in the Unix world because Windows is just a fact of life. And look, I'm sure there are plenty of people out there that will just love to stick to NFS or whatever, but like at some point you're going to need to get files remotely off of a Windows machine, and that's where Samba comes in.
Well, and its ubiquity is important. Like we talk about in the episode, but there's a Samba client on my iPhone now, which I didn't realize until we talked to Jeremy during this episode. I paid for college for the most part by running Ethernet and installing Samba SMB Windows servers for people who wanted file and printer sharing in their small businesses. And it's an important, like it is part of the infrastructure of computing at this point, I think is a fair way to put it. But we're really super excited to talk to Jeremy. And it's interesting because this is a project, unlike some of the other folks we've talked to, that isn't new. It isn't exciting. It isn't explosive new technology. It's something that's been around so long that literally everyone takes it for granted. And I think it gives him a really interesting perspective on open source software.
Yeah, in fact, this conversation, I think, went even beyond Samba itself because he's just been around in that scene from just about the beginning, right? So
yeah, it's
some fun old stories in here, some fun reminiscing about the Unix Wars. Should we mention?
Oh yeah, we should explain some stuff.
Can I please just say the words Solaris and AIX and 386 BSD
and HPUX? Yeah, there's a bazillion BSD variants. So these are open. These are kind of early versions of open Unix.
Yes, just for people who don't know, yeah, anytime you hear him talk about like SunOS, Solaris, AIX, HPUX, those are all different Unices?
Yeah, Unixes, please.
Unixes?
It's not ancient Greek.
No.
We also talk a little bit about NetWare, which is another file sharing server from the 80s and 90s. We talk about the SMB and Samba and kind of use those interchangeably a lot. SMB is system messaging block protocol?
Server message block, I believe, what it stands for.
Like we said, it's the original Windows file sharing protocol for what I think in the beginning was IPX, not even TCP/IP LANs. Samba is the Linux
implementation.
Originally, it was like a hacked port of that. Due to some stuff we'll talk about, it becomes more real. Let's see. Jeremy also talks about Tridge a lot. Mm-hmm. It's one of the other co-creators of Samba and is Andrew Tridgell.
Yes.
He's an Australian computer programmer. He's done a bunch of this stuff as well.
Yeah.
I'm really excited to talk to Jeremy, but first we have to thank our sponsors. As always, this week's FossPod is brought to you by Google Open Source. They bring all the value of open source to Google, and all the resources of Google to open source. You can find out more about Google open source at opensource.google.
You've described Samba as being kind of just infrastructure. It's not
plumbing.
sexy, right? Yeah, I was avoiding using the word plumbing.
No, it really is. It's and no one ever notices until the pipes get backed up and there's a horrible accident.
Right. So how do you describe to the layperson, meeting somebody at a cocktail party? I mean, like, how do you describe what you do and what this project is to somebody who?
So it's kind of hard to describe what I do. They say, so you write software? Oh, yeah. And then you give it away? Oh, yeah. So how do you get paid? Of course, the answer to that is Google pays me. But so how do I describe Samba? I usually describe it as the glue between Linux and Unix and Windows. Now, of course, most people have heard the name Linux now, but they don't really know what it is. And I kind of say, well, it's the stuff that runs the cloud, because it is mostly. And, it was easier back in the 90s and early 2000s because most people had some experience with a local area network. Now no one has. It's just, phones to the cloud. I'm reminded of a wonderful conversation I had with my office mate in Google, who shall remain nameless, but he was very young at the time when I first joined. And he said, this SMB stuff, it runs over HTTP, right?
No, there are other protocols in the
world. No, it really doesn't. No, yeah, I am that old. Yeah. And then I said to him, kind of, everyone's heard of NFS, or anyone in Google's heard of NFS. I said, well, like back in 1988, AT&T came up with this thing called RFS that completely remoted Unix file system. Well, SMB is a bit like that for Windows. And he just looked at me and said, I was 8 in 1988. Oh, okay. So yeah, it's a little hard to describe now. A lot of people have network attached storage at home. So network attached storage used to be very big, is now mostly moving into the cloud, but still there are a lot of people who think about, well, how should I back up? I love hanging out on the Reddit data hoarder subreddit, because those are my people. And a lot of those people, even they don't know what Samba is. They talk a lot about NAS and servers and whatever, but they don't know a lot about the infrastructure that's inside it. And you know what? I'm completely fine with that.
It's funny because our Brad and I started podcasting together primarily to talk about NAS boxes.
Oh, cool.
Free NAS back. I can't remember which one they came in. Yeah.
It's true NAS. Now they're moving to Linux. IX Systems have a Samba team member, and he does some great work integrating us with Z, or is it ZFS? I never know. If I'm English, it's ZFS. If I'm American, it's ZFS.
It's interesting watching how, like, the proprietary, maybe not necessarily proprietary, but things like how Samba kind of moved down the stack in the ways to communicate with the media servers over the last 15 years. Because it used to be that, like, you connect a Sage box or a Squeeze box or whatever to your Samba share, and it just kind of grabbed your files off. And now it's much more, you run a Plex server and it talks with a proprietary protocol or whatever.
So the interesting thing about that is that I think that was a conscious decision on the part of most of the media companies. Western Digital used to sell a really nice box that was a media player that would connect to anything. And they ended up canceling that. And around the same time, most of the boxes, there was a product called Sage TV that did the same thing. Most of those things went away in preference of, oh, no, you stream your own media. So you don't have a copy of it at home. You don't have your own copies of any of these things. So no, you can get it all from the cloud. And trust me, we won't modify anything or take anything away. So what I use at home actually is, although I shouldn't really, these are products I use. I'm going to say they're great. There's a little box made by a guy in England called OSMC Vero 4K. And I just have a house full of those. And they connect to my Samba server, which is basically a $400 Costco PC in the closet connected to, 3 8 terabyte drives, and all of my media lives on there. And, everything just plays through that, and it works great.
It's interesting because you talk about not owning your media now, and it kind of wasn't an issue for a while. And with the stuff that's happening with HBO, I don't know if you're paying attention to what's happening with HBO now. It's the kind of thing that would have been a huge Slashdot story like 20 years ago and nobody's talking about, but they're just delisting a bunch of content that Warner Brothers and HBO and the Warner Brothers brands listed because they can get a tax write-down to make a merger cheaper for them. And it means that like tens of thousands of people's work is just disappearing and will be essentially inaccessible if you don't have your own copies.
And I mean, this is partly because of the success of Netflix. Netflix took over from the local DVD rental store. And then, of course, everyone saw the money and thought, I want some of that. but I don't want to share. So, hence Disney Plus, Amazon Prime, whatever. So like I say, the data hoarder subreddit are my people. They're the ones who have all the local content. I'm not asking where they get it from. I just don't ask questions like that.
I mean, it feels like there is a move back toward local storage. Like you said, like the data hoarder subreddit is thriving. I mean, people on our Discord, I see anecdotally a lot of people talking about building home storage again. Like, do you feel like validated that you've been here in the background this whole time?
No.
Keeping this thing going, and now that things maybe are swinging back in that direction? Or?
No, you're just weird. Sorry, like me. We're just weird. Normal people don't do this. They don't. They just stream. And they're fine with that, and they're happy with that, and mostly it just works. It's only weird people like us who actually have local storage and hoard it and whatever. And, that's okay.
Sure. I didn't want to say it, but sure. You're working on a project that is kind of bridging two different worlds. You've got the Windows way of doing things and the kind of Unix, Linux, or I guess the POSIX way of doing things on the other side. Like,
it's only Linux these days.
Sure, that's fair. Is that a constant struggle, like just trying to decide, like in any given situation, like for example, like in my config, I just use like kind of standard like file and directory masks, Unix permission style, and then like here's TrueNAS saying like, no, you should be using Windows ACLs for everything now, and I'm like, I don't want to know about that. Like, is it hard juggling that tension and deciding where to draw the line on how to do things?
So Samba because Linux really didn't have the capabilities that Windows did. We just did our best. But the rule for Samba, for the past 15 years or so, we kind of muddled along for the first 15 years. But for the past 15 years, it's been what Windows does is what we have to emulate. It doesn't matter how bad it is, doesn't matter how broken it is, we have to be like Windows. And we have hundreds of thousands, if not a million lines of tests that actually say, okay, this is what Windows does. Do we do the same? We mark when we're broken, when we can't do things. So we essentially try and act exactly like a Windows server would. Brain dead, broken, whatever. Streams, for instance, are particularly nasty and unpleasant. But, Windows clients expect those, so we just try and behave like Windows servers do. Now, having said that, under the covers, we're living on top of Linux, usually, or FreeBSD file system. And so, there are some things that we can do easily. There are some things that we can't. One of the things I would love to see in Linux, but it's never going to happen so long as certain people are in the kernel, is what they call rich ACLs, which are essentially Windows ACLs inside the Linux file system. The philosophy on that is kind of interesting. The argument is because Windows has the ability to deny ACLs. You can say, this group has no access, this group has some access, and the ordering matters. So to be honest, this is too complicated for administrators to understand. What most administrators do on Windows, and I've seen this, is they say, here's the finances group share. Anyone in the finance group can write to it. Everyone else go away. and then they have it inherit from there, and they kind of delegate like that. Actually setting very, very specific permissions. I once gave a talk sometime in the mid-2000s. And I said, okay, who here, and this was to a whole group of Windows admins, and I said, who here knows the difference between object inherit, container inherit, and inherit only? And one hand went up. This was a bunch of Windows admins who were administrating large file systems for various organizations. I said, where do you work? He said, I work for the US Marines. I said, oh, okay. That explains it. Thank you. You would have to know. Yes.
If anybody's going to read the manual.
Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting you bring that up because one of my first jobs out of university was literally, I started this job working IT at the Department of Biology at the university I went to school at. And they were like, hey, we need to get rid of this Novell NetWare server. And we have this shiny new Linux box. And this was probably in 1998, if I had to guess. Mm-hmm. And I did a lot of like consulting business, setting up Linux machines for people who'd been running NetWare for years. And it was interesting because that was around the time that I remember Samba became I don't want to say actually usable because it was always actually usable, but it became.
No, those are the golden years.
Yeah, it was a good time. It was a good time for Samba. It was a good time for
1.9, not 15 around that time. Well, that was a good vintage.
Fine
yes.
vintage.
Yeah.
But when did you kind of look up and were like, oh, this is actually like you started working on this and you were working on it while you were working on other stuff for Sun, I think, or other companies?
No, actually, I was at a company called Vantiv, and I was porting their software to Windows NT, which was the shiny new thing at the time, and they were using PCNFS. I had some experience with PCNFS at Sun, and I thought, we have to get off this. This is unusable. At that time, Tridge released the first version of Samba called SMB Server. And I gave him the first patch, which was to demonize correctly. And then Volker, who's both of us are still involved, gave him the second patch. And so for me, it was always usable because I was depending on it every day. And then I realized I was actually spending sort of like 70% of my time working on the file server software rather than what I was supposed to be doing. But I didn't tell anybody. So long as I was getting the assigned work done, nobody cared. So.
And this was in like 92 or 93, I think?
Yes, this was no, it was 94, 95.
Okay. When did you, it seemed like it went on a pretty aggressive like curve there, because the thing you were providing was in hot demand for people who didn't want to buy NT servers.
Essentially, it was people who had Windows clients, but Unix servers and Solaris. Sonos was a big one for a while. Solaris was another big one for a long time. And so Windows were coming in, they were using NT for the authentication, but it wasn't great at file serving. And a lot of organizations had these very reliable, very robust Sun boxes. And so they thought, well, why not just put the file serving on that? And so that's really where Samba originally came into its element. When we first started, Linux didn't even have a networking stack. So we thought, well, this is just a toy. It's like, there were various sort of toy Unixes at that time that didn't have networking or anything. And I don't remember them. Most of them were proprietary.
Yeah.
And it was only after Linux got a network stack that it started getting interesting. And then it was the late 90s that Linux really started taking off. So, I mean, I was a porting engineer, so I was having to make this software work on, HPUX, Solaris, and on one misbegotten Unix, which it was interesting. It was like I don't remember, it was maybe Data General or somebody like that. It essentially was the Unix that had all the bugs of all the other Unixes put together. It was like this Frankenstein version of Unix that essentially had inherited every single bug that every other Unix had. And at that time, I needed a compiler that would work across everything. And so that's when we really standardized on GCC.
So what was the moment that you kind of looked up and you're like, oh, this is a thing that a ton of people are using, and it's more than just like what I'm using to share files inside my house at this point?
So when I left Vantiv and I was offered a job working on Samba, at that point I thought, hey, maybe this thing has a future. And then I went to work for a company called Whistle Communications. Who had the nicest box you couldn't buy.
Why couldn't you buy it?
They decided that their business model was to only sell via ISPs, because the whole point was this was a thing to get your small business on the internet. And it was staffed by a bunch of ex-Apple UI people, a bunch of FreeBSD engineers. That's why I first ran into Kurt McCusick, because he was fixing soft updates for us. And I worked with a bunch of great people, some of whom work with me at Google today, and so others are around the industry. And it was this amazing box. And the software was great. Samba really took off. I was working on it full time at that point, getting paid for it. And we were annihilated by a company called Cobalt Systems. And they had just a generic Linux, but they sold it in a really cool blue box. I actually wrote an article about this. You might be able to find it somewhere, called The Startup Bicycle, in which I likened working in a startup to like riding a penny farthing. And the thing I learned about being in a startup was that the massive front wheel is marketing. The tiny little wheel at the back is engineering, because what really matters is the marketing. And they crushed us. They absolutely crushed us. Because I had the choice of joining either. And I looked at Cobalt and thought, well, you guys are great, but you just have a cool blue box. Whereas Whistle has all this,
Turns out the cool blue blocks moved units, huh?
Yeah, and I think Cobalt ended up being bought by Sun for $2 billion, and Whistle ended up flaming out. And the pieces being picked up for pennies on the dollar by IBM. So, never follow my career choices. Whatever I've done, it's always lost money, except for Google. I credit my wife with telling me to join Google. She said, "You're an idiot. Of course you're going to join Google." Okay, dear. Yes. So she was right about that one.
I'm kind of curious what it was like building software that ran on what was essentially a closed API or closed protocol from Microsoft for such a long time, and how that kind of relationship changed over the years.
So it was a lot of network analysis. I don't know whether you've ever seen Tridger's French cafe paper that he did around the time of the EU lawsuit. And he was trying to explain, because Microsoft at the time was very hostile, and they were saying, "Oh, they've stolen our stuff. They're an illegal clone," was the term they used. And Trid explained, no, it's like you go to a French cafe and you want a bagel, and you want a baguette, and you sit there and you're listening to people, and you see what the waiters bring, and you go, "Oh, a glass of water." And so you say something, and then the waiter slaps your face. Okay, that was wrong. You get an error message, and then eventually you figure out the vocabulary to get what you want. And that's kind of how Samba worked. Now, there was some initial documentation that Microsoft did in the early 90s, but that was when they were competing with NetWare. And as soon as NetWare started to die, Microsoft decided, no, this is too valuable. We're going to close those protocols. Microsoft is a complete, I have to say this up front because less people think I'm going into a Microsoft pitching session. Microsoft is a completely different company now. They employ Samba team members. They contribute code to Samba.
It's hard to remember that they were the villains for the first 10 years of open source.
Yeah, they really were.
Just
the Steve Ballmer years.
Yes, exactly. Let images of Bill Gates and Steve Ballmer float into your mind, and you'll remember that Microsoft pretty quickly.
Yeah, and they really, really are different. Now, there are still elements of the old Microsoft there. It's a large company. It's complex. Google contributes massively to open source. I don't know that we get as much credit as we should for that, but it's complicated. But at the time, they were implacable foes. They really were. They were trying to decommoditize protocols. They were trying to commingle. And in fact, one of the presentations I remember giving to the EU case was Microsoft's web of interconnected protocols. And what they did for a while, and we're still dealing with the fallout from that, was that they tied protocols together. So you couldn't just, this was in some ways that really ended up hurting them, because you couldn't just do SMB. If you wanted to do ACLs, you had to then have a DCRPC server, that's a remote procedure call server, that would map SIDs, which are what Microsoft calls UIDs and GIDs, into names. And they could have done that in SMB. The whole thing was a grab bag, of course. They could have just said, oh, here's a call to get an ACL, here's a call to look up names, But that would have been very easy then for Samba and the other competitors to implement. So they decided, no, we're going to tie this to Windows NT, and you're going to have to basically build a Windows NT domain controller. And they thought that was impossible. And then some people in the Samba team did it. So, and so they're like, oh, great. By denying them the information on this, we've now caused them to emulate much more of the stack than they otherwise would have done. And now, of course, we're a full Windows Active Directory domain controller.
At that time, you were going toe-to-toe with the biggest proprietary software company in the world, and it had to feel like you were the rebels standing up against the man.
Well, so the thing about Microsoft that you can criticize them for, but you can also give them great credit, is backwards compatibility. They never break anything. Everything is always backwards compatible. So we lived in that shadow for a long time. Okay, if it's backwards compatible, we can emulate the backward compatible part and we'll work. And their clients would keep working. And so these days, we somewhat collaborate on developing the protocol. They're still the ones who say what happens and doesn't, but they listen to our ideas. they take feedback, and we found some pretty severe security issues that they've then gone on to fix in a collaborative way. So,
and how was it that Microsoft came to have such firm control of SMB in the first place? I looked up the origin of the protocol and found that it was actually created at IBM and intended for use in OS/2. So was there any legal context there, or was it purely just a situation of like market weight allowed them because they were the biggest?
I think there was when Microsoft and IBM did OS/2, it was a collaborative development, and they shared all the intellectual property. So,
okay.
Dr. Feigenbaum, I think it was. We actually had him give a talk at a conference about the early days of the protocol, and it's kind of interesting. Some of the worst and most horrible decisions in SMB can go back to trying to make it work on a server, on a DOS server that was only built for one single user. The whole idea of share mode saying, oh, I have exclusive access to this file, you can't open it. That comes from the one user machine philosophy that it was originally created by. That's caused probably more engineering headaches for more people than just about any other decision. Because it means if you're trying to build a big clustered SMB server and node number 250 wants to open a file, it has to check nodes 0 to 249 to see if they have it open too. So it means you essentially have to have a shared distributed database, which is hard. We had the occasional mole within Microsoft who would help, would slip us information or, But yeah, relations were somewhat tense for a while, reaching the bottom at the EU lawsuit.
Yeah, I was going to say the 2007 European court decision was when Microsoft was forced to publish protocols for SMB. Was kind of it was a big moment for software in general. I feel like it was one of those big turning points for Microsoft as well. It seemed like from the outside. I'm curious what it was like working with them after that and how that changed the way you work.
Well, after that, they sent a representative whose name completely escapes me. He's become very famous in the cloud world now. They sent someone to Samba XP, which is our world annual conference. Mm-hmm. And he basically said, we're serious about this. We're going to do this right. And we want you to work with us. And, give them credit when they were told you have to change. They changed. And they actually discovered that fully documenting this stuff was really useful for them too. They could actually then rely on it. You could build test suites around it. I get the feeling that very much like we were in the early 90s, the whole test suite for SMB was, well, let's run Office against it and make sure it still works. And then after the protocols were published and it had to be, okay, this is how it's supposed to work, and it was all documented, you could write genuine tests against it and say, well, this is how the document says it's supposed to work. It doesn't do that. So either fix the document or fix the code. And so you ended up having this fully specified protocol. There's still some gray areas. We still run into some interesting things, and there's still the occasional design decision that we make differently. But it's like working on serious software these days.
Yeah, I was going to ask, as part of the plumbing now, I mean, you know what happens when the plumbing breaks? I mean, is there a lot of pressure there? Are the stakes a lot higher in your mind as you make decisions than they were, 15, 20 years ago?
Well, we have the benefits of a very, very comprehensive test suite that catches most things. The places where we get hurt are the things that we haven't tested yet or don't know about, or logic bugs in the most security bugs these days aren't usually caught by dumb things like buffer overruns or integer wrap. You still get those, but we have a lot of tools that protect against those things. These days, the really bad ones are logic bugs. And so I actually gave a talk how to handle security flaws in an open source project a few years ago. That might be interesting for your listeners to look up. And it talks about 3 of the worst bugs we ever had. One of them was just after Microsoft had the WannaCry SMB1 vulnerability and as I put it, the Samba team looked at that and said, hold my beer. So we had one that was just as bad. But again, that was a logic bug. It wasn't a flaw in the coding or anything. It was 2 subsystems that were never meant to be being connected together without thinking through the consequences.
At this point, do you have a sense of how widespread Samba is?
Not a clue.
Yeah. Okay.
No. It could be dying, it could be expanding, it could be everywhere, it could be getting less. I really don't know. We never tracked it. We try and create the best, most secure, fastest file server that we can, and if people use it, that's great.
It seems like once you cross a certain threshold, there's like a data event horizon where you reach a certain scale and you just have no sense of how many people are using your code anymore at that point.
Well, we're really a pre-internet. I mean, not pre-internet. I mean, because we use the internet to develop, but the internet at that time wasn't ubiquitous. It wasn't like everyone had it on their phone or whatever. So the idea of having metrics or phone home capabilities to find out who was using it, I mean, even if we wanted to do that, it wouldn't have worked.
Yeah.
So we always just put the code out there, and we were surprised when people used it. I remember the biggest surprise I got. There's all this fuss about ethical software these days, and should software be allowed to use for bad things? Well, so I had that moment when I was at SGI back in the 90s. It's really fun because a salesperson drops into my office and said, "Hey, you're the Samba guy, right?" He said, "I've got a sweatshirt for you." He said, "These guys really love your stuff." And I'm like, "Oh, great, who is it?" And he had me this really great NSA t-shirt that he got from the gift shop there. And I thought, I'm sure how I feel about this, but hey, it's a nice shirt.
You get weird looks when you walk around the software conventions wearing that one, though, I bet.
Well, unfortunately, the moths ate it a long time ago. But yeah. I used to wear that for a while. It was very nice. It was a polo shirt, very nice. High quality stuff from the US government.
I was going to say, is that the weirdest use case you, like the most unusual use case you recall? Or
Oh, God, no.
Okay.
Oh, no. I mean, because we have a pluggable VFS, so people have adapted that thing into just about everywhere you could possibly imagine. I'm trying to remember the weirdest use case. I mean, somebody was using it to send mail at some point. Of course, that's the classic. All software expands until it gains the ability to send email. The funny way that people use it now is as an SMB to SMB gateway. I have Sonos devices in my house, but I have the old ones, and they only speak SMB1. They've added SMB2 for Steve's kernel code in the new ones, but my old ones only speak SMB1. And a lot of people are wanting to get rid of SMB1, obviously, because it's a horrible protocol. It's not inherently insecure. It's obviously just the implementation that's insecure, but it is a horrible, horrible protocol. And so what people have done is they want to have an SMB2 server, which they can make very secure, but they also want to support the old Sonos devices, which only speak SMB1 or any SMB1 devices. So what they do is they have a little Raspberry Pi. They use Steve French's CIFS FS kernel client. They mount the SMB2 share from the real server onto the Raspberry Pi. Then they run a cut-down version of Samba that only speaks SMB1. So they use it as a protocol translator to translate SMB1 from clients that only speak SMB1 into SMB2 to the real file server. Because, if you're just streaming music or whatever, performance isn't that critical. So just bouncing over the network twice doesn't really hurt. So yeah, people have used it as an NFS protocol translator, an SMB protocol translator, as a translator for all sorts of weird back-end stuff. So like I say, it's plumbing. A good plumber, you can fit the pipes together. As long as it doesn't leak, you can do just about anything with it.
The water runs downhill and payday's Friday, right?
Yeah, I remember Steve doing some tests where he was mounting, he ended up getting a loop. So he's mounting a Samba share with his CIFS client, and he'd forgotten that the thing he was exporting, he was also mounting via his client. So the whole thing locked up tight because he'd actually created an SMB loop on his single Linux box.
We talked about symlinks before, but I think everybody who has done any amount of shenaniganry with SMB has at some point linked back to a point higher in the tree than they're currently in. And that never goes well, it turns out. Who knew?
That actually fails with an E loop, and you can catch it and return the error. What he had done was he'd literally created a client to server link where the server was re-exporting something that the client was mounting. And there you run out of stack pretty quickly inside the kernel.
So SMB is, almost 40-year-old protocol at this point, and Samba is about like a 30-year-old project. What is development like? Like, what's the pace of development like these days? Is it still
exhausting?
Is it still as fast-paced and rapid as it used to be, or are things a little more settled now? I guess not.
No, because it's always 3 steps forward, 2 steps back. We've had a recent 3-year project to eliminate all possibility of symbolic link races in the code. Now, I'm hoping that your audience know what a symlink is.
It's probably worth explaining.
I think it's a safe bet, but yeah.
Okay, so a symlink is probably the worst idea in the world. So I'm actually giving a talk, which I gave at Samba XP, and I'm giving the same talk because, hey, reuse, at the Storage Network Industry Association Developers Conference in September. And it's a pun on a very famous computer science paper. And the talk is called Symlinks Considered Harmful, which is a play on the original GoTo Considered Harmful. So what a symbolic link is, it's an element in the file system. So again, here's something else that is going away. People don't know what directories and files are anymore. They really don't. I read a piece recently about students having to be taught what a file system is, where things go, because they're just used to application-specific data silos in their phone. So when you're using WeChat or Facebook Messenger, you don't know and you don't care where your files go. They're just somewhere that you get at them from only that one application. You don't really share. Anyway, so if you think of a file system, a symbolic link is essentially a go-to in the file system. And it would have been fine. And in fact, Microsoft solved this correctly. I don't normally say this, but they did a much better job. So Microsoft introduced symlinks, and they just changed one simple thing about them. So what it is when you're walking down a path, from roots, home, Jeremy, data, movies, whatever, any of those elements in the path can be a go-to that just points somewhere else. And what Microsoft did was they said, sure, you can create those things, but only administrator can do it. Only root can do it. Whereas in Unix from Berkeley, this is where they were introduced, any user who has the ability to write in the directory can add a go-to at any point. And if you rename the original component and then replace it with this go-to, you can race code that is walking down the path. And you can force it to go somewhere it didn't want to go. And of course, for Samba, where Samba has some of these things called shares, where you say, okay, /server/data. I want everything under there to be exported to the clients, but nothing else. I don't want you fishing around in my /etc directory or lib or whatever. This is a killer because anyone who has writability into /server/data can create a symbolic link that can point anywhere on the file system. And it took about 25 years. Essentially, we had an initial check and then we followed the path. And that was mostly kind of enough. But then people, obviously, you have to get really serious about security. And you could race us, and sometimes you would win. And so the whole code has been rewritten mostly by some of the great German engineers, Volker Lendecke, Ralph Boehm, Stefan Metschmacher, and I've contributed as well. Essentially, we have eliminated the possibility of following a symbolic link outside of the share path. And interestingly enough, it's really hard to do this. It's actually really, really hard to get it right. And that's the point of my talk. What I'm talking about is the APIs, the application programming interfaces in POSIX that you have to use to do this. Essentially, they're fundamentally broken. They're designed to introduce security holes because they were created in a time when nobody thought about this. So I published this talk and I said, these things are broken. We shouldn't be using them. Here's a bunch of things that we can do to fix it. And it was really interesting. It happened to hit Hacker News and Linux Weekly News. At the time, I was away on 2 weeks vacation, and I really tried not to look at the internet in that time. And so normally, if something like that hit, I would be there typing away comments. I was right. And I just left it alone for 2 weeks. And when I came back, I found there was this massive discussion on both of them. And the discussion was much better than it would have been had I participated. which was really heartening. Essentially, I would have derailed the thing, arguing the minutiae, and other people ended up saying, this guy's right. These are really bad APIs. We shouldn't be using them. And then, of course, you had the two classic ones, the two classic engineer ones. The first one, well, it's just stupid programmers and bad code. We should punish them. They shouldn't write bad code. And it's like, well, over the past 30 years, there have been 1,500 CVEs, the vulnerability reports, specifically due to symlinks, in such diverse things as Git, Rust, the Rust runtime library, And in my talk, I point out some unfixed ones that are still out there. Are the Rust programmers really bad? No, they're just stupid programmers. They should be punished. And that was one classic. And the other one I really loved was a guy who said, I'm giving you an answer in code. And he points to this GitHub repository and basically says, it's a prototype, but it can see how this can be done securely. And I took one look at it, and it was just full of race conditions, completely insecure. And that was one I did post because it wasn't on the main thread. And I just said, thank you for illustrating my point perfectly. To which the response was, well, can you prove it's insecure? Thank you. I really don't have the time.
Are you something about arguing on the internet, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that
someone was wrong. Yes, HKTD.
Yes.
Yeah. I'm curious about, honestly, the future of blank, the future of SMB, the future of Samba, the future of home networking, and kind of what it means for things going forward. Like for example, in the home, we've been on 1 gigabit LAN for 10, 15 years now, but like you're starting to see, 2.5 gigabit proliferate. There are weirdos like me who are dabbling with fiber at home and doing like 10 gigabit plus. Does that mean anything for Samba going forward? Like, do faster network speeds fundamentally change the direction of development, or is it just the same old iterative process?
It's the same old iterative process. We have multi-channel, we have IOU ring support. We are actually some of the most aggressive adopters of some of the Linux kernel APIs. We have code that we just shipped that has to cope with glibc not having wrappers for some of the system calls we want to use. And so this is for some of the symlink stuff. That's for efficiency and speed. So yeah, whatever network stuff is there, we will adapt to it. So Smb Direct, which is the SMB over RDMA, is something that is being worked on. It isn't being shipped yet, mostly because a lot of that stuff depends very much on custom hardware that most engineers don't have. But I mean, a lot of that stuff is used in data centers. I believe that Microsoft are a massive user of SMB Direct. Their Bing Maps uses SMB, or did. Well, last time they were chatting to us about it, they gave a talk on it. A lot of Samba use is these little home networks, but also a lot of Samba use is in software appliances that are now moving into the cloud. And that is a lot of virtualized hardware. So it's hard to say. And again, of course, people using it there don't necessarily have to tell us. They can just take the code and work with it. A lot of them do end up coming back and chatting with us, quite often anonymous Gmail accounts, because they don't want to say who they are. Cloud really, I think, is the future of storage long term. Microsoft have the Azure SMB server in the cloud where you can literally mount the cloud from your desktop. I would like that to be available on all clouds, and I think Samba is the means, because Microsoft obviously have their own custom code that they wrote for that. I think Samba could be the gateway for the other clouds to do that. And I think we should be, really. We have all the pieces. We need to run over quick. And again, we're waiting on the libraries for that. Most of the quick stuff is designed to fit inside a web server, so there isn't really good multiplexer that allows you to say, oh, okay, this is actually an SME connection. We need to have this off over there. So we're waiting for that. But yeah, these are things that we're planning on implementing, is a quick stack, SMB Direct. Yeah, there's a lot of work going into performance, and it's just, so Samba's big. It's really big. There's an Active Directory component that I do little bits on here and there. There's the file server component. There's the authentication component. It's one of the reasons that I'm still working on it is because it's still fun and interesting, because the code is so vast and changes all the time. A lot of it is me cleaning up some of my old messes. Like I'm working on the DFS path name code right now, which I wrote, and you look at it 10 years later and go, what was I thinking? It's always fresh and interesting. There's new stuff to work on all the time.
I was going to ask what the majority of your time is spent on these days. I know obviously the security stuff, there's constant new additions to protocols and things like that. But what else do you work on with the project?
I work on making the file server faster, better, fast, cheap, and out of control, as it were. I'm mostly on the file server pieces, tracking Windows changes, tracking correctness to Windows, scaling it up, making it work better in distributed systems, fixing a lot of bugs, actually, just taking bugs that come in. For instance, Apple recently shipped an SMB client on the iPhone and iPad. So you can connect directly to an SMB share from your iPhone and iPad. And so we work pretty well with the Apple client developers. They're great people. I love working with them and making sure that Samba works very well in Mac environments and iPhone environments. They bring us a boatload of bugs. And then there's a lot of vendors we already know, and they will bring us bugs and complaints. You're slow, you broke this, So it's just a continuous... It's a big software project. It's like Linux. It will never be done. There's always new stuff to do in it. I would love to ditch the printing part. That's the only part I really want to get rid of. We have this hazing ritual where any new Samba team member has to commit to work on printing bugs for a year.
Nobody loves printers. That's the one universal. Everybody hates printers, I think.
That code is really horrible. And it's not really our fault. The whole printing protocol in SMB is really horrible. So
this is highly indulgent, but I'm excited to hear you talk about Smb Direct. I've got a couple of secondhand Melnex cards in my PC and my NAS, and those support that protocol. It's very exciting to hear that's on the way.
It's, again, a lot of it depends on funding, and a lot of that depends on specific vendors saying, we really need this to work now. And I can't talk about who those people are. But
you talked a little bit about funding, but how is Samba mostly funded by big corporations that use the software, paying for developers to work on it, or are you getting?
It's pretty much like Linux. Okay. So a lot of the people who work on it working full time, or we get drive-by coders who are using it from corporations. Or the hobbyist developers these days are all writing apps for the iPad, iPhone, or Android. Nobody wants to work on. Nobody wants to work on the railroad anymore. Like I say, this stuff runs over HTTP, right? It's hard to find younger developers who know what C is anymore. Well, Julie, why don't you rewrite in Python or Go? Well, that would be great. C programmers who can work on this stuff, there's not that many of them.
Is it the same situation as in 1998 when people were looking for COBOL programmers to fix Y2K bugs again? Like, are we hitting that level of...
I don't know. Because Linux is so popular, so there's still a lot of people who know C because they have to work on Linux. So I think Linux is if there was a proprietary OS kernel that had dominated, or something written in some other language, we'd probably be really struggling to find programmers. But I think people who know Linux, you have to learn C to work on Linux, and therefore we probably get some of the spillover from that. I'm very grateful for that.
I was going to say, you've said that this is a project that requires a lot of maintenance and a lot of, it's a never-ending project, something that's never going to be done.
Yeah.
Do you worry if there aren't new young programmers coming up that are interested in working on Samba and other kind of core protocols of the open source world? Is it something?
Yeah, eventually we'll die. Yeah.
We all die eventually.
Everyone has a life cycle.
Yeah.
Eventually I'm going to retire, and then I won't care. as long as my server in the closet keeps working. It's not the cool new thing anymore. So it's hard to find people who, most young programmers, most new graduates, the idea of working on something like this would never occur to them. So it's usually the people who do work on it are the ones who get assigned to it and who get interested in it. And, they either get assigned to it for a product or whatever, or they get interested in it, or, they use it in administration and they decide to start learning to program. It's a niche hobby these days. I'm okay with that. Everyone has their time in the sun as the cool new thing, and eventually this will happen to Linux too. Although I don't see that happening for a very long time because it's everywhere. Linux is the most widely used code in the world.
Yeah.
All the monitors that we're looking at right now are all running Linux. They really are an FFmpeg internally.
Yeah.
I don't know. Eventually we will die. Eventually we'll become irrelevant, but who can say when that will be?
I gather that your history with software development kind of tracks pretty closely with the history of open source, the rise of Linux, and you make reference to that period, the kind of the Unix wars when everybody had their own Unix, right? And
Yeah.
like, I'm curious, through the 90s, especially I guess toward the end of the decade, like, what was it like watching? Like you said, Linux didn't even have networking out of the box when it first shipped. Like, when did you realize, like, oh, this is going to be the Unix-like that takes over the world?
I wasn't sure it was going to take over the world, because at the same time Linux came out, there was also FreeBSD, and I ran into the Jolitzes in Silicon Valley who were doing the original.
386 BSD?
Yeah, 386 BSD, that was it. Right. Yeah. And so it wasn't at all clear, and it was only after, I think, the AT&T lawsuit against the FreeBSDs that kind of delayed them somewhat. It could have been FreeBSD. I think the GPL really helped Linux, obviously. So as a porting engineer, you always look at what are the demands to make things work. And it's only in the past 5 years that we've decommissioned HPUX and a lot of the other things, because they simply can't keep up with the API churn on Linux. So I think it was around 2000, because I was working for SGI, and I left SGI and went to join VA Linux with Christy Boner, who's now head of open source at Google. And it was at that point I realized that Linux was going to take over the world. It was interesting. There was actually a Future of Linux conference that was put on by a guy called Mike Masters out of one of the consulting companies. And this was really funny. I think it was the first time. Oh, I'd met Linus a little bit before. There was a great bookshop in Silicon Valley called Computer Literacy. I don't know if anyone remembers it, but it was the hangout place for all the geeks. And I was giving a talk. Someone had just published a book on Samba, and I was giving a talk on that. And at the same time, the Silicon Valley Linux user group announced that Linus, who'd recently moved to the Valley, was going to give a talk on Linux. And it was the same night. So I was there, and I was thinking, well, maybe nobody will turn up and I can go see Linus. And about 35 people turned up. And I actually asked them, I said, you know that Linus is talking just down the road at Carl's Jr. Do you want to go and listen? They said, no, we want to hear about Samba. Oh, okay.
Wait, it was literally at Carl's Jr.?
Yeah, they used to meet in Carl's Jr. And so Linus was there. And then later on, so this guy called Mike Masters had a conference called the Future of Linux with, and he got Oracle and IBM to turn up, because the big attraction was Linus was going to talk. I remember getting there early and just seeing this queue of people around the building. And I was like, oh my God, this thing is really going to be big. And I was walking up to the door, and just so happened that Linus was walking up at the same time. So I said, oh, hi, Linus, we're chatting together. And Mike had asked me to go on first because he knows I'm, I can talk. I'm I won't say bullshitter, but,
Gregarious is the nice way to say that, I think.
I can spin a story. So he wanted me to go on first. And so he knew me. We're walking up together around the back to Linus and I. It was just so funny. I remember Mike saying, hey, hold on, where are you going? To Linus. He said, hi, Jeremy. They said, hey, where are you going? I said, Mike, he's the reason people are queuing around the block. This is Linus. I'm so sorry.
That's fabulous.
Yeah. Yes, that was kind of funny.
Kernel developers are not exactly flashy dressers.
Exactly. Except for Matthew Garrett, who cuts a sharp figure. And so, yeah, that was a massive event. And I think that was when Oracle announced that they were porting to Linux at that event. And that was really when things started to change. And then for a while, Sun fought Linux tooth and nail, because they had better engineering, they had better, not invented here, but Sun is better. And for a long time, they were right, but it really didn't matter because they wouldn't share.
That's a common path we see, right? We've talked to a bunch of projects at this point, and often what the open source project starts out as the scrappy underdog kind of figuring it out, and then they reach a threshold where there's enough people contributing code and there's enough people using it that like the pace of development increases until it supplants the thing that it was the proprietary software was originally competing with.
Yeah, and then, Sun being bought by Oracle was the final sad chapter, really. I mean, so at that point, Solaris was dead. It hasn't stopped moving yet, but it's still dead. Yeah.
30-ish years later, I mean, how do you feel about open source as kind of a philosophy, a way of working, a movement? Like, do you feel that it's healthy, that now, especially now that all the big corporate players have embraced it as the way forward?
Open source was never... open source is not a business model. Open source is the scientific method applied to software. And I remember Linus saying that, and that's something he and I really agree on. It is essentially the method of creating better software by sharing and testing and allowing other people to examine it. You wouldn't trust scientific studies that wouldn't publish their data. Why should you trust software that won't publish their source? It doesn't mean to say the code is better. It doesn't mean to say that it won't have security holes or it's inherently more secure. I think, the original, many eyes make it more secure. That's probably not true. All software is buggy and horrible, but at least with open source code, you have a chance to fix it, or you have a chance to ask someone else to fix it. I go back to, was it Bob Young, the original Red Hat? Would you buy the great salesperson? Would you buy a car with the hood welded shut? He's right. Why you would not buy such a car? You should not accept software that you can't see the source code on. I think if one fundamental idea has changed, I think that, and that's not reached everywhere. You still have people selling software with the hood welded shut, saying, trust us, it's great. I don't think you should. With things moving into the cloud, it's made the problem harder because, of course, a lot of the infrastructure that everyone depends on now is completely impossible for people to replicate and test on. You can't sort of, let me build my own cloud in my basement and see how this works. So you have to sort of trust the infrastructure that's out there. So adapting to cloud is the hardest thing, is the thing that the licensing models of open source haven't really engaged very well with yet. So Bradley did a valiant attempt with the AGPL, but that has not seen the traction that I think he hoped.
Do you think that's where we're seeing people using things like MIT and the more permissive licenses?
So the more permissive licenses, Google's standard license is the Apache license, which is fine. I'm still a fan of copyleft. I'm on the board of Software Freedom Conservancy, which is one of the only copyleft defenders. I'm still a fan of copyleft because I think that incentive to sharing is important. I don't think Linux would have dominated the way it has had it been under the MIT license. I think we'd have a million splintered versions of Linux sold under different names from different corporations. The Linux Foundation knows its existence, I think, to the fact that Linus chose GPL for Linux. The correct license for cloud, I think, has yet to evolve. I don't know what that's going to look like. I'm getting old, so maybe I won't care. Maybe I'll die before it does. I don't know. So the open source world was built for the world of the 90s and early 2000s. I think the world has changed. It has yet to catch up. I don't quite know how it's going to do that and what it will look like. I do have faith that it will, because I think the pressures there are such that things go in cycles. I mean, back in the early 90s, everything was proprietary and everyone was selling something secret. The pendulum swinging back in that direction. I think it will swing back to openness again. I think openness is an advantage.
You touched on this in an earlier interview where you talked about the idea that the thing that makes open source great is the inherent kind of review and open process, where it's not necessarily limited to open software, but the structure of open software where people are contributing and multiple people are looking at code, and there's a kind of review that's intentional and deliberate and makes the software better often, that is possible to replicate in proprietary software, but you have to, like, the proprietary software companies are just now starting to realize that, hey, you have to be deliberate about building in time for that and making that part of your process if you're not going to contribute to the larger community.
Yeah, it's always easier to just, because I've lived in the proprietary software world back in the 90s, and it's easier to just build something that kind of mostly works and ship and not think about the problems. And that's faster to market. The trouble is the software is worse. It had security holes. I know it did. It had flaws that it's like, well, no one's going to run into that, so we'll not think about it. These days, I don't think we can build software like that anymore. I don't think we should. Now, having said that, that's a very 90s attitude to software. It's changed. I think a lot of the proprietary stacks now say, well, no, we can't build stuff like this. We have to build it professionally. We have to build it tested. We have to do all these things. But I think the push for that came from the open source community. I think it made all software better. Like I say, it was the scientific method applied to software. And I think the bar has been raised for the quality of software, even in the proprietary stack. And I think we can say that open source was the impetus behind that. And, I'm hoping that openness becomes the default. Like I said, the most successful software project in the world is Linux. And it runs on everything. And most people don't know it. Almost every one of my audio devices runs Linux. The Sonos boxes run Linux. The televisions run Linux.
The screen in your
surround
car.
sound processors.
Yeah.
The Tesla runs Linux. People don't know it. It's become part of the infrastructure, but the openness is what made that happen. And so I think openness, Linux Foundation is out there saying, hey, be open, share. They don't tend to rely on the coercive aspect of the licensing, but they're trying to make the point, and I think it's a good one, that it's a better way of developing software. You will end up with better software if you allow other people to look at it. Now, that's not going to say that they will look at it. There's a lot of disasters where people say, well, I opened all this code and nobody cared. It's like, well, there's billions of lines of code out there. What makes yours so special that someone should spend time looking at it? Like the poor guy who was trying to write the secure symlink library. I mean, I spent 5 minutes looking over it, found some bugs and thought, well, this is worthless. And he was like, but I wrote it. You should look at it and tell me where the bugs are. I don't care. Sorry. You had the 5 minutes of my attention you're ever going to get.
You spend a lot of time working on open source projects, kind of contributing back to the larger community. I'm curious if there's any open source projects that you're really excited about right now.
I just joined the GNOME Foundation. I would really love a great Linux desktop because I've depended on a Linux desktop. The Linux desktop is a thorny problem that no one's ever solved. Or as my manager would say, yes, they have solved it. It's called Chrome OS. Just use that, which is fair enough. I mean, that is a perfectly great Linux desktop, but it's not my preferred Linux desktop. It's not the one that I like to develop software in. I need more than a web browser. So I really would like... I would like GNOME to get more polished, more... I'm a big fan of the desktop. I like the desktop. I love some of the audio stuff. The media tools that we have under Linux now are just tremendous. I think almost all media creation industries completely depend on the Linux toolchain. Sure, they probably use specialized Windows things for some animation or the artistic pieces or something along the Mac. But in terms of, bulk processing, AV data, Linux is where it's at. FFmpeg is amazing.
Your point about the desktop is a thing that has come up a lot for us in that we often have really highly functional open source software that isn't super usable. And I think that the Linux desktop kind of lands in that position. And I wonder if it's...
GNOME is pretty damn usable now.
Absolutely. But we talked about this with the Blender folks a few weeks ago. We talked about it with Jim over at OBS. We've talked about it as, hey, we get a lot of engineers that are willing to contribute code and programmers that are willing to contribute code, but the open source communities don't necessarily seem to attract as many kind of UI designers and
designers. Yeah. It's a hard problem because the people who have the most admired desktop, I won't necessarily say the most functional, is Apple. Now, personally, I find Apple machines almost impossible to use because for me, it's like trying to use a computer with mittens on. You just, it's like, okay, if they want you to press that button, then they'll allow you to press that button. If you want to do anything else than the way they thought that you were going to do it,
good luck.
A lot of apps on phones are like that. I don't necessarily enjoy the UI refreshes. This again may be getting old. Sonos did a UI refresh, and I'm like, where are all the things I used to do? I can't work it out anymore. It took me a few weeks to figure out where all the things were that I used to do. And, I know that some UI designer deep in the company said, well, this is much easier and much easier to use. Well, not for me, it wasn't. You just changed everything for no reason I could tell. Things just moved around. And so that's one of the reasons I like desktops, because things don't tend to move around Like you don't tend to get major UI refreshes like that on the desktop. They evolve somewhat more slowly rather than have these massive jumps that break everything. This is old man yelling at cloud. It really is. Don't change my stuff. I knew how to use that. Yeah, you're talking to a man who still uses email for most of his conversations.
Is there someplace you'd like us to direct people who want to find out more about your work, the Twitter, the mailing list, some sort of carrier pigeon?
Well, so Samba.org is the main Samba site, but it's very early 2000s because we don't really have great UI web designers, but it's functional and everything is there. The Samba wiki.samba.org is where our documentation is kept up to date. If you're actually interested in the internals of Samba, what using Samba is samba@lists.samba.org. Actually developing Samba is samba-technical@lists.samba.org. Obviously, everyone should try out GNOME and install a Linux desktop just to realize what things could be. Yeah, I mean, right now everything works. I'm using this mic. I just plugged it in. My GNOME desktop recognized it, switched over to the default mic. It's completely functional. The days of, how do I configure my X server are long, long gone. Everything mostly works now, and a lot of people don't realize that. They maybe dabbled in Linux earlier and sort of went, this is too hard, things don't work. But for these days, for most things, of course, secure boot is now the problem, but if you can get a functional Linux desktop, you should try it out. Give it a go. It really is a wonderful environment to use.
Fantastic.
I booted an Ubuntu live USB on a new build a couple days ago, and not only was the desktop at the native resolution of the monitor right out of the box, it even played a startup sound. I was like, wow, you just found everything and knew how to use it.
Yeah, the networks just work. It'll find the printers. Yeah. I haven't configured a printer in about 15 years. It just finds them out of the box. I don't know how it finds them, and I don't care. Yeah. It just finds them and prints.
It really has come a long way.
Linux, it just works. Somebody should trademark that.
Well, yes. That and a bag of beans will give you a bag of beans, unfortunately.
I think that's as good a place as any to wrap it up. Thanks again to Jeremy for joining us on the podcast. We would love for you to check out Samba at samba.org or any of the other fine institutions that he just mentioned.
That's right. Also, personal interests, personal passion for the history of Unix, and hearing him talk about all those old Unixes and like the Jolitzes, the husband and wife team who created 386 BSD that went on to spawn all of the free BSDs, the open BSDs, the net BSDs. Fun time in computing.
It's interesting because his path through this project and through open source he's been there for a lot of the rise of open source, of Linux especially, which has been really fascinating to get to chat with him about. And it's also kind of special for me because we started doing these podcasts together, Brad, talking about file sharing and NASs and all that. So anyway, thanks again to Jeremy. Let's see, up next, before we thank Google again, we are thinking about doing a questions and answer episode. Yeah. If you have questions about free and open source software or episodes of the podcast, people we've had on the show before that you'd like to get ask questions, please send them via email. That's electronic mail to fosspod, FOSSPOD, @content.town. Again, that's fosspod@content.town. The link is on the show page as well. You can click it and your email client will just open up an email with all the stuff populated already. But we would love, love, love to get some questions. And if there's enough interest, we'll do a question and answer episode. And I guess that'll do it for us this week.
That's right. I've got some stuff to edit in smb.conf, so...
Oh boy. I've spent my entire career trying to avoid editing smb.conf. We're very different people, Brad.
If you need me, I'll be working on my sharing configuration.
Wait, Nano or VI, though, is the question.
Oh no, let's not. Let's just not.
As always, this week's FOSSPod is brought to you by Google Open Source. They bring all the value of open source to Google and all the resources of Google to open source. You can find out more about Google and open source at opensource.google. This week's episode was produced by Matt Purdy and edited by Sabrina Hill. Thank you all so much for listening, and we will see you again in a couple of weeks. Bye, everybody.